Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating exploration of how communities fight marginalization and fiercely assert their unique identities. We're going to look at how people, when faced with the erasure of their culture, their voice, or their livelihood, don't just fade away. They invent, they adapt, and they resist.
Okay, let's dive into this with a pretty incredible piece of history. This quote comes directly from the first declaration of the Lacandon jungle, issued by the EZLN. It reads, "We are a product of 500 years of struggle." I think this perfectly frames that universal human drive to resist dominant, erasing forces. When you've been pushed to the margins for centuries, resistance isn't just an action anymore. It's baked into your very identity. It literally becomes a matter of sheer survival.
So, what does this all mean? Well, it brings us to the central thesis of our journey today. How exactly do marginalized communities make their voices heard? Because as you'll see, survival doesn't always look the same. It happens through completely different mediums. Some people fight back by writing dictionaries to save their mother tongue. Some plug in amplifiers and play horns to unite their neighborhoods. And others issue political declarations to demand basic human rights.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, pathways of cultural resistance. Second, Chavacano, preserving a Creole. Third, Mexican ska, the urban rhythm. Fourth, the Zapatistas, 30 years later. And finally, uniting voices of identity. Let's get right into it.
Section 2, Chavacano, preserving a Creole.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer amount of academic effort underway right now to save a language. We're looking at research aimed at building a written corpus and a spelling error ontology for Zamboangueño Chavacano. This is a Spanish-based Creole spoken by over 400,000 people, mostly in the Zamboanga Peninsula. But despite those big numbers, older generations are noticing a really sharp decline in its everyday use, especially among the youth and in the big city centers.
You see, the language is facing an absolute perfect storm of threats. First up is multiglossia. Chavacano constantly has to compete with English and Tagalog, the official national languages, along with Cebuano, which is being brought in by shifting demographics and migration as the city grows. Because of all this, it's losing its role as the local lingua franca. And then there is the youth text syndrome. We all know the chaotic ways teenagers text, right? Well, here, the modern SMS generation has developed these entirely improvised ways of spelling that are actually threatening the language's survival. Now, what's really interesting about this is the massive contrast in how people write it. Pre-2014, kids were just using improvisational spelling on their phones, mixing in English and Tagalog rules. To combat this erosion, the local government stepped in and introduced a highly complex, normalized orthography in 2014. But here is the catch. This new official spelling prioritizes the original Spanish etymology of the words. For a population that isn't taught Spanish in schools anymore, this requires a massive effort of memorization. Locals actually find it incredibly difficult to learn and apply in their daily lives.
So how on earth does a community fix this? Well, by engineering its survival through education and technology. Through the K-12 and mother tongue-based multilingual education programs, they actually made Chavacano an official school subject for the early grades. On top of that, researchers are actively building a semi-automatic spell checker based on that complex 2014 orthography. They are literally mapping out the community's spelling errors to create digital tools that will help locals write their language with confidence, preserving it for the next generation.
Moving right along, Section 3, Mexican ska, the urban rhythm.
Let's totally shift gears and cross the globe to the pulsing streets of Mexico in the late 1980s and early 90s, where a massive musical rebellion was incubating. And it didn't start in giant arenas, no way. It started in DIY venues, grassroots, independent spaces, and student festivals in places like Mexico City and Tijuana. Early adopters took the foundational sounds of Jamaican ska and rocksteady and basically smashed them together with punk energy and the aesthetics of rock en español.
If you trace this timeline, it's a wild story of a subculture exploding into the mainstream. Back in the late 80s and 90s, bands like Pantheon Rococo, Inspector, and Tijuana No brought this raw sound out of the local barrios and built a national circuit. Moving into the 2000s, the genre started diversifying, folding in local flavors like salsa percussion, cumbia cadences, and mariachi-style horn voicings. Cut to today, from the 2010s to the present, Mexican ska isn't just an underground movement anymore. It is a massive, recognized pillar of Latin alternative music, filling huge international festivals. So, the crucial point here is the groove itself. At the absolute core of this music is something called the skank. This is that signature clean electric guitar playing upstrokes strictly on beats 2 and 4, the offbeats, with a really tight, percussive attack. When you take that Jamaican rhythmic foundation and inject it with fast, double-time punk tempos and Latin dance grooves, you create a sound that physically commands you to move. But listen, this music is far more than just a dance party. It's a huge vessel for identity. The core groove requires those 2 to 3-part horn harmonies, trumpets, trombones, saxophones, providing massive, unison call-and-response hooks. Layered over all of this are Spanish lyrics packed with local slang, and the themes? They're intensely focused on everyday barrio life, student struggles, and social justice. The horns and the lyrics literally became a direct medium for working-class storytelling and social consciousness.
All right, Section 4, the Zapatistas, 30 years later. Let's shift our focus to a very direct political struggle for survival. To really understand the EZLN, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, we have to look at the objective socioeconomic conditions of the Mayan, Tzotzil, and Tzeltal people in the state of Chiapas, Mexico. The source notes that back in 1993, Chiapas suffered from systemic neglect, with 75% of its population living in poverty. We're talking a severe lack of basic services, extreme infant mortality, and ongoing land dispossession backed by the state and wealthy landowners. In stark contrast to these conditions, the Zapatista demands were clear and elemental: housing, land, employment, peace, and indigenous autonomy.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds over 30 years. The uprising kicked off exactly on January 1, 1994, literally the day the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect, which indigenous communities viewed as a death sentence for their land rights. Following the brief conflict and huge public protests, the Mexican government and the EZLN signed the San Andreas Accords in '96, promising autonomy. By 2003, the EZLN had formed caracoles. These are autonomous zones administering their own health and education. But, according to the source material, these zones have faced continuous external pressure, culminating in recent 2023 escalations where paramilitary groups like the Coffee Growers Organization, or COW, have committed forced displacements and armed attacks against these communities.
Now, the source material we are examining here, provided by the International Socialist Alternative, presents a very specific political critique of the Zapatista strategy over these 3 decades. The EZLN famously operated on the philosophy to change the world without taking power, choosing to build local autonomous zones rather than fighting for control of the national state. The ISA source argues, however, that consciously relinquishing the struggle for state power is what ultimately left these isolated Zapatista communities vulnerable to the ongoing aggressions, encirclement, and violence from capitalist enterprises and state-backed paramilitary groups.
And finally, Section 5, Uniting Voices of Identity. Okay, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, but what we've really seen is that resistance to marginalization is active, it's creative, and it's absolutely relentless. Whether a community is facing the modern erasure of the tech syndrome and multiglossia, the economic struggles of an urban working-class barrio, or centuries of historical poverty and land dispossession, they do not remain silent. They forge their own mediums. They construct complex linguistic ontologies and spell checkers. They fuse Jamaican offbeats with punk rock to shout their truths. They establish fully autonomous political zones in the jumble. They actively build the tools to preserve exactly who they are. And that leaves us with a pretty profound realization. Whether it's through a dictionary, a blazing horn section, or a political declaration, identity always finds a way to speak. It demands to be heard. So I want to leave you with this thought to reflect on today. Look around you. How is your own community's history shaping its voice today? What are your mediums of resistance? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.